What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, welcome. I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit-Down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get into another very interesting mafia topic. And over the years in my coverage of the American Mafia and watching other people's content on the American Mafia, there is no name talked about more than John Gotti. We all know his story, his rise in the Gambino crime family, his takeover of the Gambino family through the assassination of Paul Castellano, his suits, his publicity, his trials, and more. But there's one thing we don't talk about much when it comes to John Gotti. It's the men around him. Men with names like Tony Lee, Skinny Dom, Iggy, and our individual we're going to talk about today, Tony Roach. Tony Roach Rampino was a man who Gotti would meet in prison in the 60s. He would become a very trusted individual, debt collector, and ultimately hitter for the Gotti crew. The problem for Rampino was he was a heroin addict, and would ultimately become his undoing in the end. The story of the very interesting Tony Rampino. Next on Sit Down Shorts, Anthony Rampino, seen on the right, was born December 5th, 1939, in the Queens enclave of Ozone Park. Growing up, it was said that he enjoyed running the streets with his younger brother. And during his adolescent period, it was known that Tony Rampino was a very large kid. He was said to be very tall, very gangly, very lanky, but he did what many kids love to do in the 50s in New York. And I'm sure many people that are watching this video will say the same. Tony Rampino loved to play stickball. I remember during my childhood, even when I, at one point after high school, lived in Philadelphia, I remember I would play stickball regularly in a schoolyard. It was an enjoyable time, and it's something that many kids don't still do today, but it was said that Rampino loved to play stickball. Also, during his adult period, it was actually said that Rampino loved to play basketball as well. Rampino was a large individual, as I said, and as he got older, he got a lot bigger. He wasn't fat, but he was tall. It was said at one point Tony Rampino was allegedly 6'4", 6'5". He was a big guy, and that would ultimately be very helpful for him in doing debt collections down the road. The sad thing, though, was during the early 60s, something else would hurt Tony Rampino, though, and that would be heroin. He would allegedly develop an addiction in the late 50s and early 60s, and this would lead to some time in prison. As early as 1962, it was talked about that Rampino would be arrested for possession of heroin and selling heroin, and would ultimately do a prison stint. Now, during that prison stint, though, he would actually become a bit better criminal. As we know, once you go to prison, you generally become, as a young man, a better criminal. According to a book written by John Gotti's daughter, Victoria, she would actually say that Tony Roach would actually meet John Gotti inside prison, and that Gotti liked Rampino due to the fact that he was very loyal and said to be quiet and someone that Gotti could trust. Gotti would allegedly tell him that once they got out of prison, he should come start hanging out with the crew in Ozone Park. Worked for Tony Rampino because he was from Ozone Park and he was already a criminal. And I think Gotti realized he could probably use Rampino to hopefully slot in with his brothers and other people that were, as we know, selling drugs. For Rampino, he would not only be seen hanging around the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, the headquarters for not only Gotti, but Gotti's predecessors, Carmine Fatico and Danny Wagons Fatico, once they came over to Ozone Park from East New York. Rampino would actually allegedly live above the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club at one point as well. Rampino was very useful to the Gotti crew. He was someone with his size. He was very much adept at debt collection, doing different things on behalf of the Gotti crew. He also, allegedly, Tony Rampino was involved with robberies and drug trafficking. Now, for Tony Roach, he would prove very helpful as well in the murder and getting rid of bodies group as well. I want to first, though, get into when and where Rampino would become involved in his first hit, but it goes back really to 1980. But in 1979, Tony Rampino allegedly actually beat heroin. He allegedly got healthy and clean. And for Gotti Sr., I think that was probably looked at as something really good. Look, I don't think it's any secret. Certain members of the mafia at one point were involved with actually doing drugs. Vinny Asaro, another person that was involved in Queens, was at one point involved with heroin and drugs. But for Tony Rampino, he was getting clean. He was ascending at one point in the mob. And I think at one point had dreams of being a made man in the family. But in March of 1980, something sad would happen to the Gotti crew. In fact, to John Gotti himself. As we know, in March of 1980, John Gotti's 12-year-old son, Frank, seen on the left, obviously, was killed. This would all stem from a day in March when the young Gotti and several of his friends were seen riding a mini bike in the area of 86th Street in Howard Beach. The mini bike was allegedly provided, according to members of the Gotti family, by Kevin McMahon. Now, Kevin McMahon was the adoptive son of John Carniglia, and they were similar ages, McMahon and the younger Gotti. He gave the mini bike to the young Gotti. He starts riding it around. And sadly, he was darting out in the middle of the road, and he was hit by a car driven by a man called John Favara. Now, Favara was the neighbor of the Gotti family and lived very close to them in Howard Beach. Now, subsequently, after the very sad death of the young Frank Gotti, it was talked about that it was likely and clearly an accident. This was not intended. It just happened to happen, and it was very sad. Now, as a mother's grief would happen, Victoria Gotti, actually at one point, the mother of Frank, would attack Favara with a baseball bat. Now, we can understand her grief. This was her youngest child, and I'm sure many women or even many men watching this would do similar things. She probably wasn't thinking, but she felt like Favara should die for his actions. Now, on the surface, Gotti Sr. looked at it as an accident. But he would ask his wife to head down with him to Florida. And I think for John Gotti, this was a likely, hey, do what you guys got to do, but make sure it's clean. In July of 1980, just days before John Favara would actually sell his home and move away, he was seen leaving his job at Castor Convertibles in Long Island. He was a furniture salesman. He left that business and walked to his car in the parking lot of a diner called the Capitol Diner in New Hyde Park. Now, during his walk to the car, he spotted several individuals that were basically looking at him and walking towards him. He started running. An individual pulled out a silenced .22 caliber gun from his waistband and shot Mr. Favara twice. Allegedly, that was this man, Richard Redbird Gomes. Now, Redbird Gomes was a mobster from Rhode Island who had ties to Raymond Patriarca and was said at one point to be somewhat close to John Gotti. Gotti liked to use him in certain pieces of work. Now, during this abduction, Redbird Gomes catches up to Mr. Favara, who's, basically injured from being shot twice. Redbird Gomes hits him with a 2x4 and knocks him out cold. They would grab his body, put it into a van, and take it to a warehouse in Brooklyn, allegedly owned by Gotti hitter John Carniglia. According to multiple informants and the government, it was talked about that during the time in that warehouse, Mr. Favara's body was allegedly dismembered and thrown in a vat of acid and thrown in Sheepshead Bay. The person that committed this murder, supposedly the ringleader, was Charles Carniglia, and that would come out in trials many years later. Now, you're probably asking, what does this have to do with Tony Roach Rampino? Rampino was said to be that day in a crash car. He took part in this murder. Now, he was not the individual that pulled the trigger himself, but this would be very important for Rampino as he makes his ascent, hopefully to become a made member of the family. This was doing stuff for Mr. Gotti. Now, Gotti would have an alibi, supposedly. He was in Florida, so he could never have done this. But as we know, it is normal for mobsters to farm a hit out for someone else to do. Now, subsequently, after the disappearance of Mr. Favara, Queens and Nassau County detectives would actually approach Mr. Gotti about the disappearance of his neighbor. Mr. Gotti would tell the detectives, quote, "I'm not sorry the guy's missing. I wouldn't be sorry if the guy turned up dead." Now, also seen during, hopefully, to get some more information about this, the feds and the members of the detective's office in Nassau County and Queens would go to the wife of John Gotti as well, Victoria Gotti. She would tell detectives, quote, "I don't know what happened to him, but I'm not disappointed he's missing. He killed my boy." Now, we can obviously, understand her sadness. Now, I am a bit surprised at her callousness, quite honestly. When an accident happens, generally you just chalk it up as an accident. I know we can obviously want people to be killed that do things to our family. But in this case, it's not like Mr. Favara did it on purpose. Mr. Favara is basically an innocent individual. He had sadly been involved in a very horrific accident and really should have been free to go live his life and have to live with the fact that he did that. I'm sure it weighed on his conscience enough. Now, for Mr. Tony Rampino, this would prove very helpful to him in his ascent. He was being trusted by Mr. Gotti. And in 1985, he would also be involved in a very high-profile hit. We're not going to get into the particulars of the assassination of Paul Castellano and seen on the right, Tommy Bellotti. We all know that story. Mr. Rampino on that night, December 16th, 1985, was actually outside Sparks Steakhouse. He was across the street and would act as the primary backup shooter. Now, basically what I mean by that is if Artuso, Carniglia, Scala, and Lino struggled with the assassination, Rampino had a gun across the street and was allegedly supposed to come over if there was any issues and finish the act. Now, I will talk about the fact that Rampino was actually identified by a witness in the 1990s cases of John Gotti, would ultimately put him away. We'll talk about the fact that he was identified by his facial features at that hit. Now, for Tony Roach, he was feeling good. Things were going good. He was making money. He was constantly seen in contact with Mr. Gotti. He would be seen at the court cases of Mr. Gotti and also spotted at the funerals of not only Neil Della Croce, but in 1986 of Frankie DeChico. The problem for Tony Roach and other members of the Gambino crime family, they would have to face their own trials very soon. In 1986, Tony Roach Rampino would be indicted in a racketeering trial alongside John Gotti, his brother Gene, Willie Boy Johnson, and other members of the Gambino crime family. The good thing, though, for Tony Roach and other members of the family, including the new boss, John Gotti, was that Sammy Gravano, an alleged member of the family as well, actually had an ace up his sleeve. He would find a juror, a man called George Pape, to basically fix the jury. And not only did Pape fix the jury, but he would provide acquittals for everyone involved with this case. He was given about $60,000 for his work on the jury that day. He had some ties to the Westies, and they would get connected with Gravano. Now, for Tony Roach, he would be acquitted of this case, and everyone would head back to the streets. The problem, though, for Tony Roach was he was back doing heroin again. And this was talked about that even at the Castellano hit, he may have been high during that. And this was a major problem for John Gotti. John Gotti realized that though Tony Roach was trusted, he was a guy that he enjoyed having around, he was a junkie in the end. Now, at one point, John Gotti would tell Sammy Gravano, quote, soon enough, we're going to take care of all of these problems like Roach. So basically, Gotti is telling Gravano, we got to cut up loose ends here. This guy is a liability. He's going to be a problem, and we got to do what we have to do. eventually. Now, for Tony Roach Rampino, he would actually be helped a little bit, though. In June of 1987, Mr. Rampino was back involved with the drug trade, and he was now selling drugs again as well. He would get connected with a man called Philip Paradiso. Now, Philip Paradiso was the brother of Gambino family current consigliere, allegedly Michael Paradiso. Now, back then, Philip Paradiso ended up becoming an informant and flipped on his own brother. We talked about that in a video seen up here, where you can learn more about Philip Paradiso and his brother Michael. At that point, he became connected to Mr. Rampino. He would tell Mr. Rampino that he had a buyer for 4 ounces of heroin, about $30,000 worth of heroin. The problem was Rampino was selling to an undercover FBI agent, and Philip Paradiso set it up. Rampino would move the 4 ounces of nose candy and get arrested. Now, during his FBI arrest, he would quickly decide, I believe at that point he was probably high and suffering from withdrawals or something. He would quickly say, according to the FBI agent George Hanna, that he was willing to wear a wire if they would let him out on this case, and that, quote, he could give them big people. At that point, Hanna would respond, "Are you talking about John Gotti?" Rampino would respond, "You know I'm talking about John Gotti." He would also, Mr. Hanna, the FBI agent, mention the Castellano hit, and Rampino would basically agree that he could give them the shooters involved in that case. Now, Rampino never said any of this on the stand or anything like that. I think in Rampino's case, he was trying to get one over on the FBI, and hopefully they just let him out and let him go do his thing, and he would ultimately lie and never actually cooperated. But he did admit at one point he was willing to cooperate. Now, I'm not going to label him anything, but he definitely did mention that at one point he would do it. Now, we don't know if he actually would. He would just say surface things like, "I'll do this, I'll give you big people." But he ever ultimately did that. Now, ultimately for Tony Roach, the case against him was quite strong. And in state court, he would ultimately get 25 years to life for selling heroin. He would never actually appeal this case and just head off to prison. Tony Roach Rampino, probably his life was saved because John Gotti would ultimately find out that he was arrested. He spent some time in the box, and he had wanted Rampino dead anyway, due to the fact that he thought he was a liability. So for Gotti, he probably realized he might have to worry about this, but he believed maybe at this point Rampino could be trusted. He would probably get the help he needed in prison, and that was that. Rampino would head off to the State Correctional Institution at Mohawk in New York and serve his time. Now, I want to get in quickly to an excerpt from the terrific book, The Gotti Wars, Taking Down America's Most Notorious Mobster by John Gleason. As many of you know, we did interview John Gleason here on this channel. And if you want, the video will be at the end of this video. You can click on it and watch it. It was one of the best parts that I've had on this channel, and it was a great interview. In that book, John Gleason would actually talk about at one point that he would actually subpoena Tony Roach Rampino from prison, and that Bruce Cutler and John Gotti would actually have conversations on whether Tony Roach Rampino should testify and lie on the stand or refuse to testify despite immunity order and would be guilty of contempt. Ultimately, Gotti would tell him that he should just basically, testify and lie. And that's exactly what Rampino did. Rampino would ultimately deny any knowledge of who actually killed Paul Castellano. So Tony Roach, in the end, wasn't a rat. He denied any knowledge. But there is that speak in the interrogation room that he was willing to give up info. He never ultimately did, but it is an interesting story nonetheless. For John Gotti, as we know, he would ultimately be convicted and get life in prison. For Tony Roach, he would head off to prison. And during his time in prison, he would actually push and try to get early release. He would actually kind of say that in the 90s and 2000s, he felt that he should be released from prison due to the change in laws in dealing with drug trafficking. He would ultimately never be released. But during the 1990s trial of John Gotti, a witness would actually identify, weirdly enough, Tony Roach outside Sparks Steakhouse that night, a man called Angel Rodriguez would testify that he saw two men sitting in the front seat of a large dark car and saw two other men stood outside the car, one on the sidewalk and one in the street. He said he saw the man outside aim at the man in the car and heard shots. The two gunmen were long, dark coats, and that would obviously be Sal Scala and Eddie Lino. After the shooting, Mr. Rodriguez would say he also saw two men in long, dark coats walking rapidly towards him. He said he thought he saw that they were gunmen, and one man testified had large eyes and sunken cheeks and looked like a skeleton. Detectives would show him photographs a year and a half later and said he picked the man out as the skeleton. A prosecutor in the case, Patrick Cotter, would tell the jury that a man in the picture was Tony Rampino. So Rampino would be ID'd as being there that night Castellano was killed. And this would ultimately hurt Rampino in his alleged bid to get out, because the state of New York would paint him as a career criminal, one that had charges dating back to 1962. He was involved possibly in the Castellano hit. By this point, he was allegedly involved in the Favara hit, and he was never ultimately released from federal prison, or from state prison, I'm sorry. Tony Rampino would die in 2010 at the age of 71. By that point, he had developed cancer, heart disease, and he had hepatitis C. One thing I would leave you with today was the fact that there's one thing I did not mention during this show. Tony Rampino was never actually inducted into the American mob. Due to his drug addictions and other issues, he was actually never inducted and never became a member, and he died as an associate. He was an interesting individual, very colorful, very interesting, and was very involved in a lot of high-profile things that were happening in the life and career of John Gotti. I will leave you with this on Tony Roach Rampino. According to a man called Mark Feldman, a former prosecutor who supervised a narcotics case against Rampino, he would say about Rampino, he's a hardcore associate of organized crime. He's as mafia as a guy gets without being a made member. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure you hit the like button and make sure you subscribe so you never miss another episode of The Sit Down. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week here on the show.